Now on Daf Mem Beis Amid Beis, and Rav Chinina says that Sefer Torah Tefillin Mezuzah Sheksavan Tztoki Kusi Ove Kochavim Eved Isha Katan Mumar Psulim. In this entire list, if stam was made by any of the listed individuals, then it's possible. Shenemar ukshartem uksavtem kol sheyeshna b'kshira yeshna b'ksiva. Who's ever included in the chiyuv of wearing tefillin is included in the writing of Sefer Torah tefillin and mezuzahs. But kol she'ena b'kshira, anyone who's not obligated in putting on tefillin, ena b'ksiva, he's not capable, according to Jewish halacha, of writing stam. Tefillin, which was written by an idolater or any of the others listed on that list, are psulos. And therefore, according to everything we've been saying until now, if akum is possible in the asiyah, then Israel has to make a bracha. And yet, Israel ain't tzarich levarech. And yet, we're going to prove that when a Jew makes tefillin, he doesn't make a bracha on the asiyas at tefillin. Tishalach Rabbi Chia, Berei Rav Huna, Mishmei Rabbi Yochanan. Rav Chia, the son of Rav Huna, sent a teaching from Eretz Yisrael in the name of Rabbi Yochanan in terms of all the brachas you make on tefillin. Al tefillin shel yad, omer sheshikon tefillin. Al tefillin shel rosh, al mitzvah tefillin. But ve'ilu lasos tefillin mevarich. Why didn't he have a third bracha in the list of the brachas make on tefillin for the asiyah? Apparently, you don't make a bracha on the asiyah, and this appella, because according to Rav Chizda, if the guy is posel the asiyah, and that's what we had here in this brisa, that Ovei Kolchavim who made the tefillin, it's the tefillin of psulos, then therefore Yisrael should make a bracha. And here it says, Lasos tefillin lo mevarech elolav hainu taima. Now the Gemara has to set up an alternative definition as to when you do make a bracha on the asiyah, when you did not. Called mitzvah asiyah Gemara mitzvah, etc., etc. I'll come back. Tzarich levarech. Called mitzvah asiyah lav Gemara mitzvah, etc., etc. Eino tzarich levarech. So when do you make a bracha? Only on the Gemar mitzvah, when you complete the mitzvah. For example, kagon milah. And afagav the ksher b'yovikol chavim, and you would say, therefore, since it's ksher b'yovikol chavim, you don't make a bracha on the milah b'Yisrael tzarich levarech. Nevertheless, he has to. So why? Because the milah is the gemar mitzvah. But mitzvah dasiyasa lav gemar mitzvah tefillin. You're only preparing the tefillin. You're writing the tefillin. It's before the actual mitzvah of tefillin, of wearing the tefillin. Is afagav the psul b'yovikol chavim b'Yisrael eino tzarich levarech. Why? A Jew does not make a bracha on asiyas tefillin even though a guy is possible, and the reason for that is because asiyasa lav gmar mitzvah. It's really interesting because in Sfiras HaOmer we make a bracha, and yet the Gemara mitzvah is only when he gets to 49. Anyway, Vaita, the Gemara says tzitzis b'hagam. So what is a machlokas now about tzitzis? Whether when you affix the tzitzis, you have to make a bracha. Mar sover chovas talisu, mar sover chovas gavrahu. If you hold it's a chovas gavra, which is the shita of Nachman, meaning that you're only chayev in tzitzis when you wear the beged itself is not machayev. Is therefore, if you put tzitzis to a garment, then you're not completing the mitzvah, because the mitzvah is only complete when you wear the beged. But if you hold, like Rav Chizda apparently holds, that chovas talisu, that even if you're not wearing the beged, but if the beged has four corners and it could be worn, then you put on tzitzis. If that be the case, then putting the tzitzis onto the beged itself is a gemar mitzvah. That's when you complete the mitzvah, because tzitzis is a chovas talis. That's the way you learned Rav, but Anan, we have a different Masorah as to what Rav says. This is what we have. Rav Yudam Rav, the same pasuk that we originally darshan to derive the conclusion that the Yisrael is psula. Now we're going to say no. Ovi kacham is kosher. Shenemar daber el bnei Yisrael v'yasu lahem tzitzis. Let the goyim make tzitzis for you. Yasu lahem acherim, and therefore a guy is kosher to making tzitzis. And therefore, when Rav says you don't make a bracha on asiyas tzitzis, there's no contradiction at all, because any asiyah that could be done by a guy is Israel doesn't make a bracha on it. Here's an asiyah of tzitzis that it could be done by a guy. Rav. Now, this next Gemara is a gigantic machlokas as to what's going on over here. There's Rashi on one extreme and the Rambam on the other extreme, with a couple of different sheets probably in the middle. But anyway, Asan, he made the strings of the tzitzis min kotzim, min hanimin, min hagradim, psula. Apparently, when they made the tzitzis, there were leftover threads or leftover parts of threads. And the question is, and this is the question that was addressed by Rav, can you use those leftover pieces as tzitzis? And the answer is no, you can't use those. And it's kotzim, nimin. The kotzim are thorn-like threads, and nimin are embroidery threads, and gradim are like from the fringes themselves. All this is psula, and my guess is going to be it's psula because it wasn't lishma. Let me just see if he adds it. Yeah, good. Menachos ksherim. However, if he made from a thread of an ordinary ball of weaving thread, it's valid. Which means that the tviyah itself of weaving the threads, that doesn't require lishma. But just 1 second. Yeah. The tliya was done lishma. And once the tliya is done lishma, it's like the asiyah was done lishma. So what happened in all those? Because in all those three cases of kotzim, nimin, and gradim, there was already a tliya. Right, so these are like the leftover threads. But in the case of sisin, right, we're talking about a ball of weaving thread that's hasn't yet been attached to the garment, and therefore, even though it wasn't created lishma, there was no what's called tviyah lishma, but nevertheless the tliya was lishma. You have to hear the difference. There's tviyah and there's tliya, not to be confused. Ki amrisa kami de Rav de Shmuel Omar af menasisim psulim be'inet tviyah lishma. So we assume that you don't need tviyah lishma, you don't need spinning of the threads to be done l'shem tzitzis. Shmuel says, indeed you do. You require l'shem tzitzis. Here's a very famous psak of the Vilna Gaon. He says that when you make something lishma, you have to actually yell it out. So I don't mean literally yell it, but I mean say you have to declare it verbally. Hitanoi. Now we're going to say that this issue as to whether or not tviyah requires lishma is machlokas tanoim in a brisa. Tzipon zahav, right? He covered his tefillin with gold. Or shetol aleim or behema tleya, or he draped around his tefillin the hides of a non-kosher animal. Psulos. However, or behema tahora sheros. So if he used the hide of a kosher animal to drape it over the tefillin, then they're ksheros. V'afal pi shelo ivdan l'shman. So there's something called ivud, which means the tanning of the hide. And we're holding now, according to this Tana, that you don't need ivud l'shma. The tanning doesn't have to be done for the sake of the mitzvah of tefillin. And that's the opinion of the Tana Kama. So if you have or behemoth meya ksheros, the tefillin are ksheros, even though there was no ibud l'shma. Reb Shimon Gamliel Omer, Af or behema tahora, don't think that just because you're using the hide of a kosher animal, therefore ipso facto it's kosher, the tefillin are kosher. No, no, no. Psul actually you've done lishma. I need evil lishma. So we have machlok shin tanakam rishim gamliel as to whether or not you need lishma. So if we apply those same guidelines to tzitzis, then we could have another machlokas here between Tanoim as to whether or not the threads of tzitzis, when they are made, whether they have to be made l'shem tzitzis or not. And here's the equation between tefillin and tzitzis. So again, the question is tefil l'shma, spinning to create the chutei tzitzis must be done l'shem tzitzis, machlokas Tanoim, which we see by ibud in tefillin. Amalei Abaye, Rav Shmuel. What time is it? Let's just see. All right, we still have 5 minutes, maybe. Shmuel Bar Shulam. Hot chilta hechitz v'yisai. How do you dye the tcheles? Amalei, my sinon, we bring dam chilazon v'samonim. Okay, we don't know exactly what sammonim are in this context, but we know there's something called dam chilazon. For a minalu biyora, we heat up the dam chilazon and the sammonim in a big pot, and we boil it up. Martechinale, it becomes yad so lettuce, but very, very hot. V'shaklinan purta b'beasa. Right, we take a little bit of the dye in an eggshell, vitaminan lehubi udra, and we test it out with a wad of wool, and we're going to try to examine whether the dye takes hold properly in a wad of wool. Vishadinan le lahu beasa. Then we spill out the dye left in the eggshell, vikalinan le li udra, and we burn the wad of wool. Kalina means to burn. That was dyed for the purpose of testing. Shmaminot. From this statement of Rabbi Yehuda, we should derive 3 different conclusions. Number one, Shmaminot te'ima psula, that the wool that was used as a test is not kosher to be used as tzitzis. I think we had a long discussion about this in the past. Shmaminot te'ina tzvi l'shma, the requirement of dyeing lishma for the sake of the mitzvah is an absolute requirement. Shmaminot te'ima psula, the dye that was used, right, before we were using the wool of the dye that was used for a test. Now we're talking about the dye itself that was used for a test, is unfit for dyeing tcheles. Put it back into the vat. So the Gemara says, I don't get it. Hainu te'ima psula, hainu tzvil lishma. And when you say that the te'ima, which means the wool dyed as a test, is unfit to be made tzitzis out of, then that has the same din as tzvia, as dyeing it, that the dyeing has to be tzitzis. Rav Ashi matam komer, enochinami, you're right, it's all the same. Matam te'ima psula. Why is it that wool that was dyed as a test is possible to be made into tzitzis, mishum devina and tzvil lishma? Because we need tzvil lishma. And now the Gemara is going to say kitanoi, that basically this issue is a subject of the dispute of Tanoim, because the first Tan in the Brisa says te'ima psula, that would dye that was used in a test cannot be used for dyeing tcheles, mishum shenemar kalil tcheles. And what does kalil tcheles mean? Pasuk in Shmos, that the full strength pigment should be used to dye the tcheles thread. One may not use pigment in which something else was previously dyed, because the first dyeing detracts from the strength of the pigment, making the product of the second dyeing inferior. And all that is divrei Rabbi Chanina, but Rabbi Gamliel and Rabbi Yochanan ben Davoi omrim afilu marasheni sheba kosher mishum shenema ushni tolas. Even the second shade of blue produced by the dye is still fit for tcheles, because the Torah says, Ushni tolas, and we read it shni as a second dyeing of red wool, and the Torah uses for red woolen thread this phrase shni tolas, and we interpret it as a second dyeing of the red. Rabbi Yochanan ben Dahavoy infers from this that the red dye used to color the thread of the Kohanim of the Big Day Kahuna may be used more than once. And since in regard to the Kohanim and their begadim, tcheles and red thread are mentioned in the same pasuk, we learn that tcheles is compared to the red thread in regard to this law. And that leads us to Tana Rabbana, which Amir Hashem will pick up tomorrow. And then wishing you a great week. Chodesh Tov.